Hi there. Welcome to Bizarro World. This is a flag on Baden Hill today. And Baden Hill is going to be the location of a Cold War. And I just want to share from my personal experience where this flag came from. This flag is the West German flag. And even today, on my resume, I have to put that I studied in West Germany, which is no longer a country. Now, obviously, if there is a West Germany, there has to be an East Germany, which is no longer a country either. At the beginning of this segment, you saw a flag, and the flag was eerily similar to this one, but the symbol in the center was different. This one has the eagle, the symbol of strength. The flag at the beginning of this segment had a compass on it. Okay, now if you don't know what a compass is, not the kind of compass you look for your directions on, but a compass designed for designing. It's created to create, and it's a symbol of architecture. It's a symbol of industry and engineering. It's an interesting thing to have on a flag. But what I want you to know is, just like Bizarro, who was the kind of the weird, evil twin of Superman, East and West Germany, East Germany containing Berlin, and West Germany, which was bigger but was capitalist, those two countries existed side by side for 40 years. And we've already discussed this a little bit. We've talked about the Berlin Wall. We've talked about the Berlin Airlift of 1948 and 1949, which was also called the Berlin Blockade. And so right now, we're going to talk about the Cold War in depth. We're going to back up a little, and for sure, we're going to extend our reach all the way almost to the present day. Some people would say the Cold War has never really ended. So, the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. That was a movie in 1966. It starred Alan Arkin, and he is kind of a funny man. He's been in several parodies, movies that made fun of politics and war. And in the movie, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, it actually was introduced to audiences through a trailer. And in the trailer, the main character, Alan Arkin, is being interviewed. He's a Russian submarine commander, and he's being interviewed by a TV reporter in Moscow. And the idea is that there's more tourism happening in 1966, that 23,000 Americans have gone to Moscow. And the question is, how many have come to the United States? Now, this is all tongue-in-cheek, and that means that it's making fun of something that was real life for people all the way from the end of World War II onwards, and really back at the beginning of the century, from 1917 onwards. So The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. It's kind of a long movie title, but the point of the movie is that a Russian submarine accidentally ends up in the United States off the coast, and the soldiers, the sailors on board the vessel go ashore, and there are all kinds of madcap adventures, and the people on shore think that they're fighting the Cold War. It really, again, it's making fun of things like the Vietnam War and American desire to police the world and fight against communism. And in reality, a lot of people, even in the United States, were kind of sympathetic to communism because they saw kind of the deterioration of their own country during the 1960s, and then definitely in Watergate. Well, from 1917 to 1920, which was because of the Russian revolutions, remember it was a two-part revolution in February and October. The Russian Revolution led people all over the world to think that it could happen in their own country as well. And That period, 1917 to 1920, after World War I, was seen as the Red Scare. And people all over the world were worried that there would be terrorist attacks and attempts to kill world leaders to have the revolution start. There were actually plots that were foiled, that were discovered and then neutralized. And in the United States, there was a plot to mail dozens of bombs to famous people, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. So the economic leaders, not just the political leaders like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The incredible thing is we have similar things happening today. We have plots to send bombs by the mail or send anthrax powder to political leaders, economic leaders, media leaders. This is not just something in the past, only we don't talk about it as a Red Scare. So these bombs were often used by anarchists. And remember, anarchy is when you want no government. You just want to get rid of the government. Who cares? Let everybody take care of themselves. And communism and anarchy had some common ground, and sometimes people were in both groups. But communism was looking forward to a day when the government would be perfect and would have perfect control of people for the good of those people. That's what they always would say. And so there was another Red Scare from 1947 after World War II until 1960, basically when JFK was elected president. And that second Red Scare is the one we want to focus on, because that was a Red Scare where the belief was that fifth columnists from communism, from the Soviet Union, would try to get into the government in the United States. And the spies that had been brought before Congress, like Whittaker Chambers, they testified that, yes, there were many spies in the government. And the question is, were they telling the truth, or were they trying to make people scared? Because when you're scared, you make mistakes. Congress created a committee, and this was at the instigation of Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. And Senator McCarthy helped to create the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, he was a senator, and this is in the House, and so, both chambers of Congress were caught up in this idea of trying to expose the communists that might be in our midst. And so HUAC is what we call that, House Un-American Activities Committee. And Joseph McCarthy are the two main characters in our drama. And many people were caught up in this story. Significantly, J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was a physicist, a nuclear physicist who had basically invented the atomic bomb. He was working in Los Alamos in New Mexico on the Manhattan Project, but after the war, people were starting to be suspicious of him because the Soviets got the plans for the atomic bomb. And they were able to build their own atomic weapons, really escalating the Cold War. And so Oppenheimer was brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was, forced to testify. He was basically put through the ringer, we would say, tortured in a sense because of that needing to testify. He was a private person. He had to swear that he wasn't a communist, and just coming and appearing in that setting made people suspicious of him. And, one could say that it really ruined his life. And he was somebody who gave so much to our country in helping us end World War II and establish the United States as a world power. Another person that was connected to this Red Scare time was Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller wrote several plays, and the most famous one was The Crucible. And he also wrote a play called Death of a Salesman. But The Crucible is set back in the time of the Salem witch trials. And right away, people should be able to draw the parallel. They understand that a witch hunt is when you look for people to expose them and to punish them, and the evidence is very flimsy. Now, we hear that phrase a lot in the government and in media, and it has been used to the point where it doesn't really mean anything. But witch hunt should mean when you are persecuting someone who is unjustly accused. And so Arthur Miller's play is very symbolic. It's a powerful play about a husband and a wife that are having difficulties, and there are children in the town of Salem, and they are making accusations without any basis in reality. And so I would recommend highly that you'd read The Crucible, or maybe you can watch the movie that's made from it with Daniel Day-Lewis. I have a book that belonged to Daniel Day-Lewis's father, by the way, Cecil Day-Lewis. It's kind of cool that I have the book with his signature and a handwritten note in it. But eventually, Joseph McCarthy had to back up his accusations. He made a declaration that there were dozens of spies, and he had a list of those spies. So at the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, McCarthy claimed he had this list of communists in the government. At one point, he said there were 57 names on the list. And then a little bit later, he said there are 81 people who may not be loyal to the government. He gained great fame very quickly. And he even toured with President Eisenhower in 1952, meaning on the campaign trail. So President Eisenhower became connected a little bit with that hard-firing way of fighting against communism. But gradually people realized that this was a hoax. This was something that McCarthy was creating to make himself famous. And Edward R. Murrow was an investigative journalist, and he had a show on TV called See It Now, and he ran a program on Joseph McCarthy, and it really blew the lid off, and people realized that there were all kinds of people being accused who were innocent, completely innocent. At bottom, this was a power struggle between J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and the CIA. And basically, this went back to before World War II, when the CIA was called the OSS. And those two organizations have not always gotten along, because the FBI is more the internal security of the United States. The CIA has to do with foreign interests, going to other countries and basically spying there. Well, Joseph McCarthy was discredited, and ultimately he was censured by the Senate, and he, did not continue in the Senate down the road. So I think it's important to say that America was able to wake up from that nightmare. It wasn't easy, and there have been further accusations of people in the government being disloyal somehow to America, and it's a very dangerous accusation. In many ways, one person is synonymous with investigation in the United States, and his name is J. Edgar Hoover. Now, Hoover's name is on the FBI building in Washington, D.C. He is considered someone who advanced America's government and helped promote the idea of security from within. He was the head of the Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor of the FBI. He started in 1924, and then in 1935, he helped to create the present-day Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he continued. Altogether, he worked as that leader of intelligence in the United States, basically the leader of America's police force. He did that for 50 years. And so when people would think of the government and how the government took care of things in the United States, they would think of J. Edgar Hoover. The problem is that during the Red Scare, J. Edgar Hoover was digging deeply. He had actually been a part of discovering German spies and German involvement in the United States during the 1930s. And I think people generally trusted him because of the strength that he projected. The thing is that the Red Scare was largely fabricated, and J. Edgar Hoover was frustrated by the direction that the Supreme Court was going. The Supreme Court was saying that it was not lawful, according to the Constitution, to punish someone, to put them in jail because of their political opinions, even if they were anarchists or communists. And so Hoover pressed further, and he created a program called COINTELPRO. And COINTELPRO was responsible for a lot of dirty tricks. I want to talk about somebody else who is involved in this story. It's very interesting. His name is Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn was McCarthy's right-hand man. Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn worked closely together. Roy Cohn was a lawyer and business person, and basically he helped McCarthy know how to navigate the political system. Roy Cohn also helped President Donald Trump become president. He was the one who shaped Donald Trump in his response to crises, and when people accuse or attack President Trump, he follows the Roy Cohn model and he fights back. And some people really respect this. Other people see it as an abuse of power. It's important that we know that Roy Cohn was involved with McCarthy, and so when President Trump uses the words witch hunt or McCarthyism, it's very interesting and very ironic. And J. Edgar Hoover then, being the person in the FBI doing the illegal dirty tricks like wiretapping and even breaking in and trying to discover things to have evidence against communists, that reminds us of Watergate, and it reminds us a little bit that the FBI has been under attack recently for its desire to find whether the Russian government helped the Donald Trump campaign in 2016. And that has been a big controversy in the time when I'm making these videos. So we'll see how that all plays out. Spies like us. Those are the stories of the 1950s and into the 1960s. These are stories of spies, and there are so many interesting stories. I don't have time to discuss everything, but we'll take a few of them in turn. We need to talk about two men who were or weren't working together. The first one, Alger Hiss, was accused of being a Soviet spy in 1948. Hiss worked for the State Department, and he was actually a part of getting the United Nations going, and so he was an important government official. The other man is Whittaker Chambers, and Whittaker Chambers was also accused of being a spy, but ultimately he agreed to testify for the government that Hiss, even though Hiss had denied under oath that he was a spy, Chambers said that they both worked together and that they were spying for the Soviet Union. So in 1950, Alger Hiss was accused of perjury. He went through several trials. Eventually, he was found guilty. And Chambers, even though he said he was guilty, he was not punished because he had been a witness. So you wonder, was he telling the truth? Alger Hiss denied that he was a spy until his death, but the damage had been done. And in history, people still remember Alger Hiss as a Soviet spy and Whittaker Chambers as a truthful man, even though we don't know for sure. The key is we have, again, a lot of these same kinds of things happening in our government today, where people who are in high places are being accused of things, and we need to know that it's evidence and facts that we should always pursue. when we're trying to know the truth to the best of our ability. There are many people who we don't have much information on. We don't know them very well as a general American public. One of them is Elizabeth Bentley. She was a paid informant for the FBI. She had been a Communist Party member and a spy, and basically she defected to the American side and became an informant. And it's her testimony that led to a lot of the discoveries during that HUAC committee movement and the prosecution of Alger Hiss and also Klaus Fuchs. Okay, we're going to talk about the Rosenbergs now, because the Rosenbergs are the ones that most people think of as spies during this Cold War period. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, along with Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. In fact, David Greenglass is really at the center of this story. He worked on the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and he had very sensitive information about what was going on there. So did Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was a German who had managed to come to the United States, again escaping and then cooperating. He worked for the British mission at Los Alamos at the Manhattan Project, and he was found to be a spy and was giving information to the Soviets throughout World War II. And imagine what might have happened if Hitler had gotten the atomic bomb and had been able to develop it. For the most part, the Rosenbergs seemed to be peripheral players. It seemed like they weren't that heavily involved, but they had been members of the Communist Party, so maybe they were just easy targets. Eventually, they were accused and convicted and sentenced to death because treason of this level was considered a crime punishable by execution. And so as their execution date came closer, there was a lot of publicity, and people who were against the death penalty or who believed that the government was not doing the right thing, they protested, but the Rosenbergs were executed. And it's very important that we kind of take a step back now, because your readings actually imply that at the very least, Ethel wasn't involved very much. And that's what people have thought over the years. And they've thought, Julius probably didn't even do very much. It seems like David, who was the hardcore communist, he's the one who is responsible for this, and the others were just sucked into this problem. After the fall of the Soviet Union, at the end of the Cold War, documents were released and were researched heavily. And there was evidence that Julius and Ethel were both involved in recruiting David as a spy and communicating with Klaus Fuchs, and that there was a problem. And whether the death penalty was appropriate, it was certainly a case where millions of Americans were in danger because of what the Rosenbergs were doing. So I leave it to you to decide what justice was in that case. And there are always new developments being discovered every day, it seems like, as our technologies improve and we find more documents. Now I have to put in a plug for my favorite music group, U2. And so we're going to talk about U2, and we're going to talk about the U2 incident. In 1960, the Cold War had already built up to such a point that people thought that at any moment there could be a nuclear or atomic exchange, and they even thought that that would be the end. That would be the end of humanity. President Eisenhower had been a faithful steward of the military and American society through a very difficult time. He probably could have done more during the McCarthy hearings and been more vocal, but at the end of his presidency, he was very clear that the military-industrial complex was a danger, and we'll talk about that in a second. But President Eisenhower faced maybe his greatest crisis in 1960, and it was when a U-2 spy plane flying over the Soviet Union was shot down by the Soviet air defense. and there was a pilot on board, and his name was Francis Gary Powers. Gary Powers was essentially taken as a prisoner of war during the Cold War, and he was sentenced in the Soviet Union to prison, and 2 years of prison and then 7 years of hard labor. He would have been there for 9 years. Because President Eisenhower showed restraint, he was able to work things out, and gradually by 1962, Gary Powers was released, and it was a prisoner swap. A Soviet prisoner in the United States was given back to the Soviet Union, and Gary Powers was able to go home, and that is a happy ending of sorts. Just know that President Eisenhower didn't want to fly U-2 plane missions, which are spy planes, long wing spy planes that are way up in the atmosphere, and they, take pictures of the enemy. And he didn't want to do that over the Soviet Union because he knew that if the plane was shot down, that it could be seen as an act of aggression, and it could trigger an atomic war. And he was a wise man, and we are grateful to him for the way that he handled this crisis, and in not trying to deny when the evidence was clear. At first, the American side said it was just a weather mission, but gradually it was clear that it was a spy mission, and the United States admitted it. So it was a defeat in one sense, but it was also, again, a part of establishing what had to be happening during the Cold War, where presidents made such critical decisions. So we come to President Eisenhower's farewell address. He made it clear that the military was growing increasingly powerful. He was a part of the military. He was the general and organizer of D-Day. And so you could even say he won World War II. And yet he knew the power that the military could be used for the wrong reasons. He had seen that firsthand with the McCarthy hearings. And when we say military-industrial complex, we mean that weapons are fueling the military, and the military are fueling the production of weapons, and people make a lot of money from producing weapons, just like Hitler was creating an economy with his war machine. So Eisenhower, again, gets credit. He was a graceful loser. No, I shouldn't say loser. He was a graceful man when he departed the presidency. His vice president, Richard Nixon, did not win against JFK, but I think there was a very clear, clean transition between President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, even though the country was quite divided in some ways. It's a model. That's how politics can work in a democracy. And again, these are models that hopefully we can follow today. We've already discussed some of the main crises of this Cold War that was developing between the Soviet Union and the United States, but there are some more critical moments that we need to discuss. And one man comes to mind. His name is Fidel Castro. And he was a revolutionary, but he was a very well-trained revolutionary. He had attended the University of Havana in Cuba, and he studied law. But it was at that time that he became a leftist, meaning leaning toward communism, and a revolutionary. He wanted to overthrow the corrupt government of Fulgencio Batista, who was basically making lots of money from being the leader of that country, and it wasn't really a democracy. It was simply a country that wasn't a threat to the United States, and so the United States looked the other way when Batista committed atrocities and abuses against his own people to stay in power. And Castro was trying to overthrow this dictator. Well, he did so in 1959, And the United States was very concerned. And from that point forward, there were many attempts to get him out of power in Cuba, meaning that the CIA tried to assassinate him multiple times. And that led then, after the transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy, President Kennedy was making some critical decisions. And even though he was new to office, he signed off on an invasion that was really the support of an uprising against Castro's leadership in Cuba. And it was called the Bay of Pigs. And that has gone down in infamy because it was such an incredible failure. The CIA was supposed to call in support for the insurrectionists, the revolutionaries who were siding with the United States. And this may have been Kennedy's fault, that he declined to send in air support to drop bombs to support the troops on the ground so that they could have a chance to overthrow Fidel Castro's government. So the air support never came. The revolutionaries were basically captured and destroyed, executed, and it was a black mark on Kennedy's administration. From that point forward, Fidel Castro realized that the United States would never be friendly to Cuba with him in power, and he leaned toward the Soviet Union, which is natural because he was a leftist, a communist. And so Fidel Castro became very cozy with Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, the leader of the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev had been more and more antagonistic toward the United States. He's famous for going to the United Nations and taking his shoe off. And when you take your shoe in your hand, it's in Europe, it's a very dirty symbol, and it's used politically when you don't like somebody. But he used his shoe as a gavel and was banging on the podium saying, "We will bury you. We will bury you," to the United States. Interestingly enough, Khrushchev actually, behind the scenes, was doing things in America that usually Soviets hadn't done. He actually visited Iowa and learned about farming techniques. So it was the beginning of some major changes. He did not last, though. And it was because he was actually friendlier to the United States than people thought. And so eventually he was put down in the Communist Party, and new leaders were elected or were chosen by their Communist Party leadership. So Khrushchev is one character here, and JFK on the American side, and Fidel Castro in Cuba. And the result was in 1962, the discovery by spy planes that the Soviet Union had missiles that had been transported to Cuba and were being assembled. And this was an extreme threat because it made it possible for the Soviet Union to hit the United States before we could even launch our missiles. And so JFK and his administration secretly were deciding what to do. And what ended up happening, because there was a report that there were more ships from the Soviet Union on their way to Cuba, and Kennedy decided to blockade the island and refuse to allow those ships to come. Now, it was a moment where anything could have happened. Just one mistake could have started an atomic or nuclear war. And the ships were coming. The blockade was standing firm. JFK was on the phone saying, "You cannot do this, you cannot do this, you cannot do this." And finally, the Soviet ships turned around and went back to the Soviet Union. It was a victory for the United States. 13 days that crisis had lasted, and people in the United States knew that this could be the end, and especially people connected to the administration. So that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and JFK skillfully averted not just a disaster, but the end of existence as we know it. Now I want to talk a little bit, we're backing up, because we want to talk about JFK and what he meant to the nation. We've seen two examples of leadership, the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a mixed bag. You can't say that JFK was a perfect president. And he had been elected with less than a majority. he had more votes than Richard Nixon, but it wasn't a 50% majority, is what I mean by that. So the election of 1960 was a profoundly contentious election, and people were actually saying that JFK, if he were elected, he would be faithful to the Pope rather than to the American Constitution because he was Roman Catholic. And so there was a lot of bigoted behavior toward Catholics. And in addition, the Kennedys were seen as maybe being friendly with civil rights leaders, and so the people in the South were not especially ready to embrace him, except that his vice president was the senator from Texas and was an elder statesman, Lyndon Johnson. Well, he was elected, and people saw it as the new beginning, a new era. They called it Camelot and that actually was a musical on Broadway, very popular musical about King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. And so Kennedy was seen as Arthur, and Jackie Onassis Kennedy was seen as Guinevere, and they showed the world a face of America that was very pleasing and very idealistic. And young people wanted to join politics and get involved because of things that he said, like ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Many things along those lines. Kennedy also established the space race and the goal of a moon shot. The idea that by the end of the 1960s that human beings would set foot on the moon. And he gave a famous speech initiating that space race. Of course, because of the 1950s and Sputnik, the satellite that had been launched by the Soviet Union, and then our effort to catch up with the various early space programs, that was really the main reason that we were trying to reach the moon and have a presence in space. It was because the Cold War made it a huge competition and a high-stakes battle of technology. So the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the space race, those are the three things that we can remember about JFK's administration because it only lasted for 3 years. In 1963, on November 22nd, JFK was assassinated. Immediately, in most people's minds, the idea was, did the Russians finally get away with murder? Literally. And Lee Harvey Oswald was captured. He had been in the school book depository in Dallas that day, and there was evidence that he had brought a gun in and had fired from the window of that building and had been able to kill President Kennedy. Now, when Oswald was arrested, he claimed that he was just a patsy. He was just being used as an excuse, that there were other people in a big conspiracy. And as he was being led to jail, he was shot by a man in the crowd named Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby came out of nowhere. He was a nightclub owner and didn't seem to have a connection with Oswald, but he killed Oswald before he could say any more. And Jack Ruby then would eventually die before anything more could be learned. What a crazy series of events. Eventually, there was a commission established with the head of the Supreme Court being responsible for it. It was called the Warren Commission. Earl Warren was the head of this commission, and they were trying to find out what the answer was, who shot JFK, and they eventually concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK, even though there's a lot of evidence that seems contradictory, and it seems kind of incredible that he was able to accomplish what he did, but stranger things have happened. Because of the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill so poetically established, it's easy to think that the Soviet Union was just unbelievably strong. It seemed that they always had the answer to everything that the United States was doing. And they seemed to cast doubt on the power of a free society. Well, that's not completely true, and we know a lot more today after the fall of the Soviet Union than we knew back then. There were several uprisings that took place during the Cold War. Now, the way that they ended is the reason that eventually the Soviet Union ended. The first one happened in East Germany in 1953. On June 17th, there was an uprising of construction workers. Basically, in a society where people are being forced to do things, you will always have revolutionaries. You will always have people who don't want to do what they are told. And there were strikes, and there were actually protests throughout the German Democratic Republic. Now remember, East Germany goes by the German Democratic Republic, or that was their name before. I'm still living in the past. And the Federal Republic of Germany was West Germany. So German Democratic Republic, Federal Republic of Germany, again, bizarro world. And you have the evil twin, right? So the main thing is that this involved 1 million people, and there were 700 different locations. So this was a widespread uprising, and it could have spelled the end of the East German government. But the Soviet occupiers, basically, it wasn't a free country at all. The Soviet Union had their tanks and their troops there. They put down this rebellion brutally, and it did not continue, and it was not successful at bringing change. In 1956, there was another uprising, and this one was definitely a different kind of uprising. It happened in Hungary. Hungary, like so many Eastern European lands, remember it had been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it had broken into its own country after the war. Hungary had been occupied by Soviet troops when they took over for the Nazi invaders. And the Hungarian people were pretty sick of being occupied. Well, it started on October 23rd in 1956 with a student protest. The students wanted more freedom, and they marched through Budapest, and they got to a radio station, and they tried to get in. The student delegation was arrested. Demands were made to release them, and the government refused. And as a result, people all over the country rose up, and they would not tolerate this affront to the Hungarian people. And the government collapsed. And all the way until November 10th, this was an opportunity for change, and the Hungarian people organized into militias. They were going to drive out the Soviet troops, but a massive Soviet force and tanks, they were sent into the country, and it crushed the rebellion. And, again, I think it's probably that experience that inspired George Lucas in writing some of these chapters of the Star Wars saga. It's the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. 2,500 Hungarians were killed, along with 700 Soviet troops. And sometimes that makes you realize, wow, okay, this wasn't just the Goliath crushing the David. 200,000 Hungarians had to flee as refugees. And, Hungary, one of the first countries ready to get rid of communism at the end of the Cold War. It would be 12 years before there was any similar effort to resist Soviet occupation. And that happened in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, in 1968. Now, 1968, we've discussed numerous times that was a year of tragedy and chaos around the world, whether in the My Lai incident or JFKs assassination or MLK's assassination. It was also a time for the Prague Spring. From January all the way until August, Czechoslovakia had a new leader, and the leader of the Communist Party there was Alexander Dubček. And Alexander Dubček, he wanted things to be different. And so he started changing things to decentralize the government and create more democracy. This is what all the communist countries said they were doing. They said they were having democratic elections, but it wasn't really true. And so Dubček resisted, and eventually the Soviet Union and all the other Warsaw Pact forces poured into Czechoslovakia and put down the Prague Spring. Now you may remember the People's Spring, which was in 1848, and that was a revolution all over Europe trying to establish more democracy and freedom and maybe communism. It's when Marx and Engels wrote Communist Manifesto. So 48 and then 68. It's 120 years after that, but it's the same kind of spirit. And we also have the Arab Spring. So it's a common way to define a political uprising, a political change that may or may not be successful. In order to understand how things changed in the Soviet Union, we need to talk about another man, and his name is Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was in power from 1964 forward. I've already mentioned that Nikita Khrushchev was ousted from power, and it was Brezhnev who did this. Brezhnev was the protege of Stalin, and he worked his way up through the party. And he was then, a member of the Central Committee, and then the Politburo, and then he was the Communist General Secretary, the most powerful person in the Soviet Union. And that happened in 1964 when he got rid of Khrushchev. And so Brezhnev ruled from 64 all the way till 1982. His 18 years of rule, they were second only to Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin ruled longer than him, but it just shows the amazing way that Brezhnev influenced modern Russia and the modern Soviet Union. So Brezhnev started out with having to deal with these crises, and he did it in a brutal way. When he, along with the other Warsaw Pact countries, crushed any insurrection in Prague, he was showing his strength. But that isn't what people remembered him for. He was very conservative, and he believed in stability. And he also believed in investing a lot in the military and getting involved in world events. And because he did that, there was a realization that the Soviet Union could not just be enemies with the United States, but there had to be some give and take. And this give and take was called détente. Détente happened during the 1970s, and it involved people like President Nixon working together with Brezhnev to have more of a partnership in dealing with the way things were going in the world, especially as there were crises in the Middle East. There was a danger that something in the Middle East could lead to war between the United States and the USSR. And so this détente was an easing of tensions. There was cooperation within the space programs, an amazing thing that never would have been considered back in the 50s and 60s. So the 70s were a time of relaxing, but it was also a time of economic stagnation. And this would culminate at the end of the 1970s when Brezhnev realized he couldn't just continue making nice with the United States. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led to a boycott of the Olympics in Moscow, and that was under President Carter, and we'll leave that for next time. In order to keep this video from spiraling out of control, I'm going to try and just hit the highlights of what happened regarding the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the end of the 1970s through the 1980s and even into the 1990s. So here we go. We're going to talk about the Soviet Union and the move away from détente as the actions of an evil empire. That phrase comes from President Ronald Reagan, and we're not to Reagan yet, but we need to know how President Reagan was elected. President Carter was elected because of a backlash against President Nixon and his vice president, Gerald Ford, who had basically been embroiled in this Watergate scandal. Now, President Ford apparently didn't get involved in the Watergate mess, but he paid the price. He lost the election of 1976 to Jimmy Carter, the governor of Georgia, and a peanut farmer. Okay, and he got a lot of grief over that. A lot of cartoons made from that. But Jimmy Carter had a belief in, again, rapprochement with the Soviet Union, trying to continue détente. He worked together with Brezhnev, but there were things that were gaining momentum in the opposite direction. Mainly, there was unrest in Afghanistan. People wanted to, there were communists that wanted to overthrow the government there, which was friendly toward the United States and the West. And the communists then were supported by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union then decided to move in, invade Afghanistan. As a result, President Carter began sanctions, especially saying that the United States and all of its allies would not go to Moscow for the 1980 Summer Olympics. And that was a big deal at the time. There had never been a boycott of an Olympics. Usually, sports and politics were supposed to remain separate. And we'll talk a little bit later about the Black Power movement and the protest at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. This was a very dark time. If you ever want to see a treatment of this time, watch the movie Miracle, a Disney movie about the U.S. Olympic hockey team. And so the U.S. Olympics were in Lake Placid in New York, and it was supposed to be this big celebration, but the understanding was this might be the last Olympics that we saw for a while. And the Soviets were so good at winter sports that it looked like it was just going to be another total domination and humiliation. Well, the U.S. men's hockey team, comprised of college players, amateur players, and then the Soviet team, which was practically a professional hockey team, they came together, and the U.S. beat them in the Miracle on Ice and ended up getting the gold medal in hockey. And it was a symbol. It was a symbolic moment that the United States was not this weak country. They could be David defeating the Goliath of communism. So it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's what I remember as a child. So Ronald Reagan had been elected, or was elected in 1980 after all this happened, because the country felt totally humiliated in general. It was, nice to have the Miracle on Ice, but at the end of 1980, the country wanted to change, and Ronald Reagan was elected, and he was very anti-communist and promoted a sense of strength to many people. And he declared the Soviet Union to be an evil empire. What happened in 1982 changed everything. Brezhnev died, and Yuri Andropov took over for him in the Soviet Union. And he was extremely hardline, very conservative, and it was a point where nuclear war seemed possible at any minute. And then he died, and a new leader took over. His name was Konstantin Chernenko. He was very unpredictable, and we didn't know what was going to happen next. And he died. And then a new leader took over, and his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev took over with a plan for reform. Gorbachev was actually connected to Khrushchev and had supported some of. And so this man, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a reformer, he took over in 1985, and something was changing. Everybody knew that the Soviet Union could not continue doing what it had been doing. And Gorbachev came up with two new proposals. One he called glasnost, and this was an openness to the rest of the world. Before that time, the Iron Curtain had kept anybody from knowing anything about what was really going on in the Soviet Union. Perestroika was his other proposal, and that was economic reform. Not bringing in capitalism totally, but giving some private ownership to people. When I heard this as a student in the United States, I couldn't believe it, because for so long the Soviet Union had seemed like such an iron enemy. Gorbachev was a symbol of change, and he was well liked around the world. He actually smiled, and people thought that maybe this was the new beginning that we had been waiting for. Well, President Reagan famously went to Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." Unfortunately, President Reagan had his own mess to deal with, and he wasn't able to achieve the tearing down of that wall. He was involved in a scandal, at least his administration was, and who knows what he knew and when he knew it, but that was called the IranContra Scandal. The Contras were a group of freedom fighters in Nicaragua fighting against the government, and they were illegal, and the CIA wanted to help them, but the Congress would not give money to fight the government. They would not give money to the Contras. So the Reagan administration decided they would sell weapons to Iran in order to get money to give to the Contras, all secretly, a triangular relationship that would give the Contras, who were anti-communists, it would give them a chance to fight. Sounds kind of good, sounds like a part of the Cold War, if you believe that communism is evil, but people didn't buy it, and eventually it was discovered, and it created problems for President Reagan as he finished his second term in 1988. A new president was then elected, and it was the vice president for President Reagan, George H.W. Bush. And it was George H.W. Bush who was able to see the fall of the Iron Curtain and the fall of the Berlin Wall in October and November of 1989. And the Velvet Revolution is the name for the revolution in Czechoslovakia that happened in 1989 as well, and on into 1990. I arrived in Germany in 1990 in January and was able to be a part of the aftermath of these events. I stood on top of the Berlin Wall. I saw the artifacts that had been left behind as shrines for the people who died in Prague during the Velvet Revolution there. And finally, in 1991, there was a coup attempt against Gorbachev because there were hardliners in the communist government who didn't want to see any changes anymore, and they thought they saw the Soviet Union falling apart and slipping away, and so they tried to take over the government and they kidnapped Gorbachev, but they failed. And one of the main reasons they failed was because of the mayor of Moscow. His name was Boris Yeltsin, and he was seen as this maverick figure, not really a communist, and he was very well liked by the Russian people, and he then became more powerful than Gorbachev, and he became the leader of the new Russian Federation that was established. That wasn't the end of the story. Yeltsin wanted to reform everything, get rid of communism, and many people were on board with that, but unfortunately it meant a lot of hard choices. People would lose their jobs as a market economy came into the country, and inflation skyrocketed, and there was a lot of unrest. People looked back and they said, wait a minute, we were an empire. We had the Soviet Union, and now we're just this struggling country. And so there was a constitutional crisis that came about because the Duma resisted President Yeltsin. And President Yeltsin had the power of commander-in-chief. He sent in tanks, and they stormed the Duma and arrested the leaders who were nationalist leaders. And as a result, the Constitution was rewritten to give the president even more power. And that led to the current situation with Vladimir Putin being a very strong president who can basically make choices to do whatever he wants. And the country is largely today run as an oligarchy, which is a group of very, very ultra wealthy business leaders who control the resources of Russia and make billions of dollars. Even Vladimir Putin is a billionaire because of his involvement with these oligarchs. And so that leads us to the present day. I really hope that you followed that last burst through history. There's a lot more to learn. Go find out. You can make a difference in the current situation, how Russia and the United States live out our future together. It's important for me to mention really quickly that after the Cold War, people thought that there would be one big party and everyone would live happily ever after. There was a man named Fukuyama who actually wrote an article called The End of History, as if all of the conflicts of the past were now nothing but nightmares and everyone was awaking from the dream. That would not prove to be the case. And we are living in another installment of this difficult situation. You have a superpower in the United States, but you have other countries who want to be just as powerful. We'll see how that turns out. Thanks for watching.